Hi guys, how are you? Let me know when you start to sign on so I know who I'm talking to. Okay, today I'm going to talk about a couple things that I kind of started to talk about last week, but sorry, it's really bright. I'm just going to move over a little bit. I started talking last week about ways that stress impacts health. And one of the related topics that I wanted to address was really how optimism, pessimism, positive expectations, and those pieces impact your health. So we may not always think about, sorry, my dog is wandering around. We may not always think about how these ways of thinking, how these beliefs, how these ways that we're wired, these personality characteristics, or these habits of thinking that we get into, we may not always realize how they affect our health, but they impact our health quite a bit. There's lots of research in the health psychology world, and other fields, I'm sure, around how beliefs, how perceptions of health, how expectations, impact our health outcomes in a lot of ways. You can see my dog sniffing me as I'm talking. All right, so he'll just be in the background walking around. So there's some really interesting research that I won't get into too much, but really around how people who are optimistic have better health outcomes, and people who are pessimistic tend to have less positive health outcomes. Also, specifically, folks who have really positive expectations around healing or health or their ability to improve their own health tend to fare better, which is really interesting, right? Because this is a really clear way that how we think about and how we approach health and our own outlook affects how healthy we are, affects our health issues. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the bucket of optimism and kind of the bucket of pessimism. So I know a lot of people kind of generally know what that means for the most part, but I kind of want to talk a little bit about how it's defined in the psychology literature. So people who tend to fall in the optimistic bunch tend to believe that things that are not so great that happen to them, bad events, are temporary, are specific, and are external. So this means that they see a bad event, because bad events happen to everybody, right? Bad events happen to people who are pessimistic, who are optimistic, who are in the middle, who whatever, right? Like, you can't avoid that. So it's how you perceive these events, though. It's how you perceive these circumstances. So if you're seeing this bad event as something that's temporary, that's going to go away, that's kind of an anomaly, right? That's very specific, and that it's external, right? It's something that has happened, and that's all right. It's not something that we have to own or take on. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to move on to kind of what it looks like for a pessimistic outlook. The idea here is that folks are thinking that bad events that happen to them are permanent, lasting for a long time, that they always happen, right? There's this belief that this is sort of just how things are. It's always there. It's kind of a longer term, permanent type of scenario. That it's pervasive, that it will ruin everything, right? That it's going to somehow bleed into many areas of their life, and that it's their personal fault, that it's their own failure for whatever reason. And that good events are temporary and out of their control. So good events are sort of these just completely random things that just like plunk out of the sky and maybe show up in their world, right? But that they're not able to control those, or this is how they believe, right? So this can be a larger conversation about like patterns of thinking that we get into, right? Do we kind of catastrophize things, and when something happens, we think it's the end of the world? Do we kind of blow things up out of proportion? Do we put a lot of always statements in front of things, right? Like, this always happens to me. This is always how it is, right? When maybe that's not exactly the case. And we may be doing these things in a way where we're not even realizing that we're doing it. We're just kind of wired in this way. I remember something that I noticed for myself was when something would happen, I would think, like even small stuff, like daily hassles, small things, or kind of big-ish things, I would always think like, oh, I'm just really unlucky. Like, I have the worst luck. This stuff always happens to me. I'm so unlucky. Like, I'll be the person that this bad thing will happen to, and everybody else seems to be okay. And I realized that this was sort of stuff that I had learned through my parents. Like, they would say sort of things like this to me growing up, right? That was kind of one of their go-tos. Like, oh man, that always happens to you, or man, you're just so unlucky. I mean, they were loving and supportive people, but it was this type of wording or phrasing that eventually I kind of internalized, right? And then I would see these particular scenarios or situations that happen in my life, and I would put them into that belief system, right? Like, oh, this always happens to me. Like, oh, I have really bad luck. Like, of course this would happen to me, right? But that's not true, right? When I started to really unravel these things and really thought about them and kind of took a step back from what was happening or different scenarios, I'm like, oh, this kind of stuff happens to everybody. It's not a big deal, right? But it's really how we describe it to ourselves and then how we hold on to it. So the idea is, when we're looking at pessimism and optimism, is how do we explain these things that happen in our life? How do we perceive the world? How do we perceive ourselves in it? How do we perceive others? So what are our beliefs around others? What are our beliefs around ourselves? What are our beliefs around the world? Right? And that belief system really sort of sets you up to live in this more optimistic or this more pessimistic place. So one of the things I wanted to talk about around optimism is the idea that, like, for those of us who are not naturally wired as optimists, and I'm putting myself into that category, that's not necessarily my default setting. It kind of is now. I've worked to get it there. But I think the first step in moving from a more pessimistic approach to a more optimistic approach is the idea of cognitive flexibility, which is sort of a fancy way of just saying being more flexible in your thinking. Being more flexible in how you look at situations and the explanations that you give to situations. So being flexible in your thinking, right? That's like the quick and dirty way to say that. So to take your first step out of pessimism and moving towards a more optimistic way of looking at the world, try to look at things in a more flexible way, right? Is this always how it is? Is this the worst thing that's happening? What does this say about others or yourself? Maybe nothing, right? What is another way that you could look at this particular situation or circumstance or whatever it is? So trying to look at things from a variety of different angles, trying to look at them in a flexible way, will pull you out of that rigidity that comes with more pessimistic outlook. And so when you're trying to bring yourself into this more optimistic outlook, this is stuff that you have to work at, right? It takes effort to look at a situation and say, well, what are the different ways that I can look at this? Is this something that I need to own? Is this something that is a result of me? We want to be honest about that, right? But if this is something that's a temporary event that happens to a lot of folks that will likely pass, is that change the emphasis, the intensity that we put on it? So looking at things in a more positive way can take effort until it becomes part of your default, until you kind of rewire yourself to think in that way, where then your default does start to be something more positive. Like, what can I learn from this experience? Why did this pop up in my life? Maybe laughing about it or having some humor around something. Looking at stuff in a more positive, like, no big deal, I can handle this. kind of way, where we're trying to balance our reaction and align it to what's actually happening. So this optimistic perspective doesn't mean that you have to like not acknowledge negative emotions or feelings that come up, because that's going to happen, and that's totally normal and natural, and I'm not saying you should push them away. But I'm saying as you're looking at something and choosing a way to react, if you feel initially upset or frustrated, that's the moment to say, all right, what are some other ways to look at this? How else can I take this situation in? What does this really mean? And noticing when you're getting yourself caught in these things that will pull you into a more pessimistic way of looking at things. Or maybe just something that feels like it would keep you stuck in spinning around a particular situation. And what I mean by spinning is sort of that like going over it and over it and over it in your head. So if you guys are interested, I'm always happy to talk more about different ways to kind of move into a more optimistic way of thinking. But some of the things that you can do as a regular practice are, one being what I was just describing, right? Is that in the moment, trying to take a more flexible approach to looking at life. Two is a regular gratitude practice. That can be really, really helpful to like ground and root you into what's going on. Three can be more of a meditation, sort of stillness, maybe yoga practice, where you're really working on a way to cultivate peace in your inner self, sort of regardless of what's going on around you. And working on resetting your approach so that you're looking at situations in a more positive way, in a way where you're wondering, what can I get out of this? Or what is this teaching me? Or why did this pop up in my life right now? Or this is not a big deal. I can handle this. This is a temporary scenario. Can help you approach things in a more balanced way, where you can feel more positive about them naturally, or that it won't knock the wind out of your sails, right? It won't throw you for a loop. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that you guys understand sort of how that plays into health and your overall stress level, right? Because as we talked about last week, if we're constantly in this place of like stress overdrive and our sympathetic nervous system is driving the bus most of the time, and we're in this place where we're feeling angry and mad and frustrated because of these daily hassles and daily stressors that are coming up for you, even sometimes larger things, we're not in a place where healing can happen. We're not in a place that's optimal for healing, for digestion, for the body just to take care of its sort of self-repair mechanisms. We're not in a place for that. So if you're in a place where you're feeling more peaceful, you're feeling more optimistic, you're feeling calmer, this is going to naturally help your body do what it needs to do. Okay, so I think that feels like all I want to say about this. I saw some people popping on and off, but I couldn't tell who for some reason. It wouldn't come up for me. But if you have questions about that, just ask them. We can talk more about it, and I hope you guys have a good evening. Bye.